So I've been thinking for a lot about what art can do for activism and what activism can do for art. And as I was thinking about it, I noticed that there's already a category called activist art, which is an ongoing site of debate and has been since the practice materialized in the 1980s. But before I actually describe to you what activist art as it is accepted in the Western canon is, I first want to ask you what you think activist art is. And I'm going to present a few artworks and just would ask you to deliberate on what is it that would make them activist and what is it that it would not. So the first one is this etching by Goya. I picked Francis Goya because he's considered to be the first modernist, and modernists were the ones who brought politicized art so that it would be in favor of the people. I mean, I know that that's a broad statement, but they were the first ones to actually start doing this through the avant-garde. And the avant-garde is the very ambitious want of merging life and art together so that there is no distinction between the two practices, which clearly relates to what we say is activist art. So this etching here depicts two Spanish women being sexually assaulted by French soldiers. It was made during the Peninsular Wars. It's part of a series called The Disasters of War. Interestingly enough, it was commissioned by the Spanish king, who asked Goya to just travel the land and depict what he's seeing, and Goya did. So that's clearly not an activist artwork, right? How about this one? So I'm sure you're familiar with this one. It's Beat the White with the Red Wedge. The red wedge is the Bolsheviks, the triangle, and the circle is the White Army, the Mensheviks, and it was made after the Bolsheviks won the revolutionary struggle against the Mensheviks, and this was made in celebration of their victory. So it's as propagandistic as it gets, yet still this is not activist art. Neither is this, even though I think this is the most activist piece of them all. This is the fountain by Marcel Duchamp. It was it was submitted it was submitted to an exhibition where the promise of those who were accepting artworks was that they would display anything that was submitted. So Marcel Duchamp came up with this idea to sign it Armat, which is a derivation of the company that made fountains that was very prevalent and popular at the time. Signed it and submitted it, and guess what? It was rejected. So Marcel Duchamp took it on his own hands and exhibited it, and it's a ready-made. It became a whole thing. It modernized art. It brought into question what an artwork is, what an artist is, and Duchamp's famous saying is like, whatever I say is an artwork because I'm an artist. So, is this, and he made this clearly to critique the capital relations that were ongoing and the myth of the artistic individual genius, who is, the authority and power, and they are the fountain of talent for people to immerse themselves in, which clearly is a fantasy. So that is not an activist artwork, and neither is this, which depicts, it is a photograph taken during the My Lai massacre in Vietnam, surrounded by these two words taken from an interview with a soldier who personally murdered people, civilians in Vietnam. And the interviewer asked the soldier, "And babies?" And the response was, "And babies." And yet, not an activist artwork. So why? So I looked at Tate Modern, and they describe activist art as a term used to describe art that is grounded in the act of doing and addresses political and social issues. So it's an activated process. It's almost like it's a verb. And so if doing is the necessity for an artwork to be an activist artwork, then we can see why the four examples that I've demonstrated here are not activist. So Lucy Lupart, I want to introduce her because she's a god in my field. Everybody goes by her standards. She was instrumental in the establishment of the categories performance art, feminist art, minimalist art, post-minimalist art, and activist art. And she was the one who advocated for there to be a recognition of activist efforts as they come through aesthetic solicitization in artworks. She said that artworks made from 1980s onwards had a different quality to them. While prior to 1980s, artists clearly produced political artworks, and it could be argued that art can't not be political. From the 1980s onwards, the nature of art changed so that it started to incorporate these elements to it. That is process-oriented, that is collaborative and hybrid, so it's building bridges between different communities who would not have gathered together were it not for the artwork. It often incorporates different media within a single long-term project. The artist is no longer the individual genius, just like Marcel Duchamp envisioned it. He's more of a catalyst. Oh God, I said he to the artist. Okay, the ingrained stuff, internalized misogyny and all that. Sorry. So the activist, the artist is the catalyst and the synthesizer. It is localized, so this is a very important point. Activist artworks don't just allude to political or socio-political issues. They don't reflect on it. They don't deliberate on it. They do all of these things, and then they ask their audience to do something, change something very specific in a specific location. It is site-specific, issue-specific, and audience-specific. And it's also, activist artworks utilize public space in creative and innovative ways. So just to demonstrate Lippard's points, these are two artworks. The first one is Jenny Holter's inflammatory essays, where she writes down the inner thoughts of people from like a vast range of political spectrum. So from the ultra-conservative right to the radical left. So one example that I picked here is from somebody who advocates for guns. And we can see their quite phallic fantasy of what a gun is and what a gun can do. So that would not be an activist artwork because it is only political. I don't know if it's becoming clear, but to me it never did, which is why this presentation happened. So the other artwork that is decidedly activist art, and that is established by everyone, is Guerrilla Girl Says, Do Women Have to Be Naked to Get into the Met Museum? Where they demand an increase in the number of artists, women artists and marginalized artists, artists of color, to exhibit in art galleries and museums. And they, as I have mentioned here on this slide, it fits the bill of almost all of these process-oriented, different communities, single long-term project, artists as catalysts. We don't even know who the Guerrilla Girls are, and it is site-specific. So there is a specific inquiry, site of inquiry there. Why I am thinking about political art and activist art is because I'm actually influenced by Arseli Dokumacı's Activist Affordances, which is a book written by a woman who lives with disability for people who live with disabilities. And Arseli Dokumacı mentions in that book that people have to inhabit a world that is harsh, cruel, and lonely. And in order to do that, people who live with disabilities have to come up with creative ways just to sustain themselves, just to sustain their lives. So for example, someone with rheumatoid arthritis can't lift their arms when it's a flare-up to brush their hair, so they have to do something like this. And Arseli Dokumacı describes that as a dance. So these are all dances of labor. And she asks for a naming and recognition of such efforts that she describes as activists. Just in their dance of labor, they're activists because they're changing something about the world, making it a little bit more livable for people like themselves and themselves. So I thought, well, why don't we expand the definition of activism and art so that we can, because for me, activist art was too limited a category that dismisses a lot of the efforts that are being put in order to attain social justice. So I thought I need to expand this category. But before I do that, I want to say this still isn't an activist artwork, which is the roots of activist art as it has become established in, again, the Western canon since the 1980s. This is Ellen Capro, which you might be familiar with, his happenings. He built a wall from cinder blocks, jam, and bread right next to an empty parking lot next to the Berlin Wall. And as he was building the wall, the police arrived and asked them to stop. And Ellen Capro explained that, but this is only art. We're just doing it for ourselves. And the police actually let him get away with it. So he was able to continue the performance, and he toppled the wall. And this is, so I want to ask here, like, this clearly has a specific ask, but it's not activist. Why is it not activist? Because this is a little bit more activist than Sweet Wall. Because this is by Joseph Beuys, who envisioned a world where everyone, he actually articulated every individual is an artist, and he envisioned a world which was what he named a social sculpture, so that everybody would involve in activities that better themselves, and in the betterment of themselves, turn them into artists. And he thought that this was possible for everyone. So this was made for Documenta 7. He submitted it, the project, which was a 5-year-long project. And it was that he would, and him and collaborators and anybody would plant 7,000 oaks in Kassel, Germany. And he wanted this project to grow bigger so that it would encompass the whole world. So that would, in the process, teach people how they can be creative and change their social realities in the process. So the difference between these two artworks, I hope, are becoming clearer now, whereas this is still a little bit individual artist genius-y. This is completely taking that power away from the artist and giving it to the people, which is the effort of any revolutionary struggle, I think, in my opinion. So this is 1982. This is what Lippard is describing as activist art. So I want to just give you one more example of what the difference is. And I want to look at Merle Eucalyptus Laderman's work for this. She's the epitome of feminist art. She was so instrumental in what became a category later after her efforts. So she wrote the Maintenance Art Manifesto in 1969. And it came about after she just had a baby, and she came to the realization that she's never going to earn any money as an artist, never going to be recognized as an artist while she has this baby and she has to do the labor and fold the laundry and wash the dishes, that it is just an unachievable goal for her. So she said, fuck that, I'm going to work with what I have. And what she had was like dirty diapers and practically house gadgets. So she started documenting all of these using photography and text. And she said, well, these are the private maintenance works of an artist, as it is possible in the circumstances under which we live. But she was still dissatisfied with the unrecognized labor that she was undertaking. So she decided to go a little bit more public. So she first went to the museum level, where she started washing the Hartford Museum, which was the only one that provided her with time and space to do anything in the museum, like just the era. She just washed physically the museum, and she invited people who were like walking by to join her, but this was still a solo project. But we can see the scale growing bigger and bigger, because this is the final step of maintenance art, where she enrolled herself as an unsalaried worker at the garbage disposal sanitation station of New York, and she personally shook the hands of 5,000 workers, thanking each one of them, saying, like, thank you very much for keeping this city alive. So I proposed this as an activist artwork to my supervisor, Dr. Natalie Lovelace, who disagreed with me and told me that I should pick a better example. So I didn't, because I wanted to make this case that I think this is activist. So what is the demand, though? The demand is to have better relations between people where no labor is going unrecognized. The class relations are fixed so that the lower classes aren't ignored and looked down upon. And also it answers the question of like, who's going to pick up the garbage after the revolution happens, which is like the big question, right? So I think that qualifies this as an activist artwork. Yet, Natalie's point was that the vision of it was too grand. So let's fix all the relationships, but how are we going to do that? Is it even possible for everyone to shake the hands of every single other person? It just doesn't work that way. So here's another example of what Natalie does not think activist art is, and I do. This is Rick Trevania. He made Untitled over many, many years. So it was a durational project. He rented galleries and he cooked curry and rice and he just gave it to people. He just invited people to have curry and rice free and sit at the gallery and talk. He put like chairs everywhere and there was no demand except just eat and socialize, which is the core of any relational activity that we engage in, which is the revolution is a relational activity. Yet again, the wish is a little bit too big for people to not go hungry, the world not going hungry. How do we manage that? So I agree with Natalie to an extent, but I think the problem with that perspective is that it ignores this artwork, and it also ignores a very important reality of people who live in the not so privileged part of the world. So before I get to this artwork, I just want to say it is not always possible for people to articulate their demands and their like sites of action and not get incarcerated or murdered by the government. So sometimes you have to allude to things. That is, that is what political art supposedly does. Sometimes that's the best thing that you can do. So this artwork is a performance installation by Wafa Bilal, where for a month he locked himself in a gallery that he had turned into a living space and created this instrument, which is a gun, not plastic bullets, a paintball gun, that with a camera attached to it, so people could shoot him shall they decide to do so. And he ended up receiving 60,000 shots by participants from over 130 countries over the duration of a month. And he was so traumatized by this performance. But what it did, he also created an online platform. The webcam was for that, so people could shoot online. And on that online platform, people talked about how racist they are, how awful they are, and people's really inner demons came out. But it also created a beautiful opportunity for the Human Shield Project, which was just volunteers who realized, oh, this man's gonna die, and banded together to redirect the gun whenever someone targeted him. So they just stayed up for 24 hours. They had a list, and they protected Wafa Bilal out of their own volition, which is beautiful. So it is clearly, the demand isn't to actually shoot an Iraqi, it is to not. So the demand isn't obvious. It is not collaborative in the sense that it is not people coming together to take the action towards something. It's people coming together to take an action against him. So that's dubious. But still, this would be political art, which I think just is unjust to its activist nature and call, and also the pain of the artist. And also, if we were to take a limited understanding of what activist art is, we're going to be dismissing what this is, which is art and activism at the same time. So I think that there is more to be recognized in all, what we're doing here. What we're doing, this is an artwork, if we go by what Joseph Beuys says is an artwork. So what we're doing here should somehow be recognized so that our own activism is not going in vain, because sometimes the revolutionary exhaustion is real. We don't always recognize you know, that we're achieving something. And it's, as Angela Davis says, I think somebody said it, like, freedom is a constant struggle. So in that struggle, if we could realize that we're making things and that makes it worthy, and even if we're not all artists, it still can be art. So thank you.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
So this is a fantastic panel, lots to talk about here. My head is just spinning around, kind of thing. But I want to just open up the floor to everybody else before I kind of say a few things about what we've done. Just to see what other questions are out there. If people have
a comment and a question. A student Iraqi, the gun was supposed to move side to side only, so he's only shot from here to here, and somebody hacked it online and made it made it move vertically. The counter hackers hacked it back to make it to the original, so he's not shot in the head and in the lower body. And he had an area of the gallery where he could sleep hidden behind a barrier. But my question is for all of you, because the papers kind of respond to each other, is this notion of constructing the public, reconstructing the commons through activism, through performance, through a public discourse with multiple vocabularies. We saw that. So we see the sports in the mainstream. So, you know, people going to these sports events are spending thousands, if not, you know, I think hockey tickets, you know. This is not an area of protest that is spontaneous and cheap, right? If you're gonna protest at the hockey game or mostly soccer games, right? You know, I don't know, tickets are not cheap even in Europe. So this is a mainstream kind of privileged space, class-wise. But yet, you know, the messages are coming through. We saw that in stadiums in France recently, for spontaneously bringing up all these signs for Gaza, right? You know, so there's that. You know, the protest with multiple vocabularies, but it's also protesting with communal gathering and also collective mourning. There's a sense of grief there. We are a wounded culture, as what's his name said. So you know, we saw the humor part, but I can't believe I'm still protesting this shit. It's mournful. It's grievable. It's grief. You know. I mean, as funny as it is, it's really sad. It's true. I saw another sign that says, "I can't believe the librarians are protesting." The librarians are out. You know, like who the fuck? You know, even though, you know, my protest days we have librarians protesting, but now they're saying, "I can't believe the protest." The librarians are protesting.
Librarians are still around.
I can't believe librarians are still around. You should say. So, you know, there's when we think of protest culture, we think of it as a positive, looking futurist and looking forward-looking. But we don't. Maybe we need to think about the grievability of the subject, grievability of bodies that we're trying to kind of an embodied epistemology we're trying to reclaim in a way. And it's a question why anybody would like to intervene. Sports, definitely. There's the embodied epistemology of sports, right?
Yeah. Anybody else? Oh, go ahead.
I mean, these are amazing presentations. Thank you, all of you. The main thing that I always think about, and that's why I was talking to some people here from SJB, that because I'm doing some computational textual analysis for like some movements in the States and in Canada, and I feel the tone sometimes does not attract a lot of people to join the movement or to join the action. I was thinking about different tools and different ideas, and I feel these are like from sport to drama to art and podcast. I feel all like how we can just invest in all of these things to change what do we have now to a better thing, right? Because I feel these maybe strategies, tactics, all of them are really important. So maybe this is an open question. Anyone would like to answer? Yeah.
I would like
Go ahead,
to
go
say
ahead.
something. Probably, yeah, adding up what you said, maybe it's the frustration. People are looking for another ways to express their feelings about what's happening, but also, for example, in sport, yeah, they pay, but people, in my thinking, they are trying to escape also about this reality, but even in that venue, they are still receiving the same message. So probably the frustration is increasing, is how I see it.
That's interesting. About professional spectacularized sport and that kind of way.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, I can answer your question about how we change this like this. So I think we do, because when you talk, you make a change for a long time. So you don't expect from art or culture to make a revolution in a few days. But I think when we change our mind and our children's mind, so then the change will be coming. Absolutely, yeah.
I think one of the points I was trying to get at too was I feel like this time around with Trump, part of what's happening, of course, is we're not seeing these big organized protests, but that's partly because the media is not covering them. And but I also think that I feel like one of the whole themes of cultures of protest and what we're talking about during this event is to move not just from resistance to the anti-oppression side of things and actually understanding what it means to be oppressed and then using that to fight back.
Let me jump in with a couple of thoughts and I guess a kind of invitation and to continue the questions that you have put on the table, both Danya and Leanne, in terms of these presentations and linking it back to your presentation and the previous panel as well. And a kind of question that's been coming up throughout the whole series or the whole 2 days in terms of other presentations. We had a kind of brief discussion about these kinds of things after Nazmo's keynote yesterday as well. Like earlier on, we were talking about different kinds of movements and about the old left movements versus the new left movements and the differences between feminism, let's say, and kind of traditional leftist politics and so on. And back in Donnie and our day, right, one of the things that people used to say about the new social movements and so on is that the old political movements were all about changing the economy and taking state power, right? And whatever people's analysis was about why either that was not the right thing to do, not advantageous, or impossible, or whatever it might be. There's all kinds of different arguments were brought forward in terms of problems with the old left, including their collusion with powers that be, with Pax Americana and so on, right? So there's a long historical kind of things about whether that's the Soviet Union coming up with a kind of peace relationship with the United States, what happens in the Soviet Union itself, and so on. On the other hand, the argument that was made by our generation in a certain kind of way was that what was much more important, rather than the base, was the superstructure in the form of culture. That what social movements had to do, what protests had to do, was change our hearts and minds and souls, rather than what, in fact, traditional sociology of movements and so on, this whole resource mobilization theory and the ideas about what are the opportunity structures under which protests and movements happen and so on and so forth. That has a lot of, I think, has a certain kind of insight, because it is true in all kinds of ways that you need time, you need resources. There is a certain privilege to being able to act politically, kind of thing. And that example of I forget her name, the care.
Merlu Kalasdada.
Yeah. Her artwork really speaks to this kind of issue in that kind of way. That you can there's a kind of patriarchal structure to the modern world of protest, precisely because it's predicated on another kind of labor that somebody else is doing, women are doing, right? That somebody else is doing that makes politics kind of possible in this kind of way. There's other aspects of this that have to do with the town square as a place where old forms of politics, or the street where the old forms of politics happen, versus what happens to cities where the square and the street is no longer, doesn't have the same kind of relationship to people's lives anymore, kind of thing, right? So there was this kind of thing about a new kind of politics that had to do with culture, signs and symbols, art, all of these things, and this is a couple of resonances in terms of your paper and your paper too in this regard, Ivan, is that, for example, humor and this place of sports in all of this as well, right? Is that humor on the one hand is this, and I'm really glad that you brought up Bakhtin, because one of the key theorizations of this was that the thing about laughter is that it's a very spontaneous thing that happens. It's an embodied revolution that happens in our way of being in the world. And the key thing about that is that you can't plan to laugh. I want to set up my diary and plan my next week of what I have to do, and what meetings I have. I can't write down Tuesday at 2:30, I'm going to laugh, right?
Schedule with laughter. We need that. Schedule with laughter, ready?
Right? So this is Bakhtin's point, right? So that in this world of rational calculation that dominates and arranges everything in our lived existence, laughter is an eruption that turns all of that upside down, right? And so this becomes one of the key kind of ways of thinking about the importance of activist art, political art, as opposed to the politics that's already embedded in modern art, in the Adornian view of art in that kind of way. Now, in the case of the sports arena that you're talking about there, what's really interesting about this is that, yes, it is a corporate spectacle kind of situation, so it is part of mass culture, but there's also, and especially football in Europe, is both mass culture, but it's also popular culture, right? And that when the fans do this in this surreptitious kind of way, and when a black football player, and these football players have to sign 1,000 different kinds of contracts about, what their body weight's going to be, who they can talk to, just like models in that kind of way, right? So when a black football player decides to take a knee, that is also this kind of eruption of a different kind of political space inside of this corporate spectacle in that kind of way. And that made me think, because there's a few of you have asked questions, and it came up in papers, in your paper too, I think it was, about revolutions without revolutionaries, or who are the revolutionaries, and so on, right? And the interesting thing, and I guess I want to put this in terms of especially our conjuncture at the moment, which is that in a way we don't know at all what activist art is. We don't know what politics is, right? But at the same time, we have this incredibly important issue before us, is what is the difference between politics on the left, which is what most of you have been talking about, and what Angela was talking about here, which is the politics on the right in that regard. And it does seem to me that if you think about politics on the right, you see something that is very distinct compared to what all the other examples we've been kind of so far thinking through and looking at in the last 2 days. In the case of politics on the right, it is very well organized and has a very top-down kind of formation.
Lots of money.
And
Yeah.
tons of money, even though it's working through all of these contemporary media forms like podcast, Twitter, and so on and so forth. And I think that there is a real danger and a real, something that we really have to think through, that when we talk about hashtag activism and we think about the new social media as a way of doing politics, and it is the case that new media forms, and this is, you were gesturing to Innes, this is one of the points that he makes, that new media forms mobilize new forces, new political forces, new groups, new subjectivities become communicable in a certain kind of way, right? And we see that that's happening both on the left and the right. But by just looking at Twitter or X or looking at whatever social media platform we want to think about, will not help us make the difference between what is the politics on the left and what is the politics on a right. And yet, this whole question about, well, these people are gathered in the case of Nihal's paper in Sri Lanka, they're gathered in an urban space, but what are their demands? We don't know. Occupy, what are their demands? We don't know. The student encampment on campus, what kinds of demand? I mean, at one level, the demand is very straightforward and profound, right? The what is happening is in Gaza is simply unacceptable, right? But on the other hand, what specifically can you get anybody to do? Well, nobody can know that in our particular kind of circumstance. And the old idea that we would take state power and there's a whole set of policies waiting in the wings that we could bring together, not that that's entirely wrong, because there's a lot of things we know that can make the world better. Decommodification, for example, more robust frameworks of rights and so on and so forth. There's a lot of things that are part of the modern world that are certainly, if you were to list a kind of what should be our platform on the left that one could come up with, but beyond a certain level of generality, it becomes unknowable, right? And this is where I think art in particular, and your questions are, I think, very, very important in this kind of way, because it really helps us think through, well, in this kind of situation, what could a group come up with to say, this is what we're demanding, when we don't know what it is what would it make sense to make any kind of demand? Let's just gather. Let's just, take up this space and that kind of way, right? Anyway, this was a long rant and ramble, but I was all kind of excited by all of you folks. So,
I was just
yeah.
going to add, one of the results coming out of the U.S. election is some people on the progressive left that there's infighting. I don't exactly know what's going on, but from podcasts and YouTube channels, a lot of people are saying, like, we need a Joe Rogan on the left or something like that, and then you can't reproduce that. You can never reproduce where that came from, because it is a particular space-time situation that created Joe Rogan and other far-right influencers. And I was just also thinking back to 1999 and getting close to getting on a plane to go to Seattle and thinking, I always felt like, and I wrote about this, but I always felt like that late 90s time and space had potential. And then, 9/11 happened, and I feel like that's sort of where we are. That's sort of far, between George W. Bush stealing the US election and then moving to these highly repressive laws. And both on the political spectrum, I mean, we're seeing laws passed to prevent people from gathering. And we've seen it passed by so-called center-left people as well, right? So I don't know, I mean, I feel like a new form has to come from the quote-unquote progressive left or the activist left. And I think we're personally, I think we're way more creative than, and we're also smarter than them, which might be a bit of a problem because it's so bad, I'm sorry.
I don't know if it helps us, yeah.
But I mean, I think Steve Bannon has read a lot of Gramsci, so I actually take that back. So, and he understands what he meant.
I mean, taking over public space used to be a promise of democracy.
Yeah.
It was an invitation to reimagine democracy. Right now, it's a fear of assault. And think of Charlottesville when they ran the protesters over with a car, and then even January 6th events.
Yeah.
And I start thinking that the kind of civil rights movement used to be or lefty movements. I wouldn't qualify the civil rights movement as specifically lefty, but let's say it had a lefty, let's say, underpinning. But they were centrifugal, which means that they would go from the center and away from the center. And right protesting used to be centripetal. So they'd go from the periphery to the. Now it's the other way around.
Yeah.
Right, if we can think about it this way, in terms of movement in public space, right? It's the other way around now, and then at the same time, the official discourse on the right is Antifa's doing all of this shit. We don't even know what Antifa is. Yeah, I think it's the infiltrated left, like remember battle in Seattle, 1999.
Yeah.
Those who set the fire to the garbage bin were basically anarchists infiltrated by the police, and people took pictures of their boots. They were police officers undercover, and they were wearing police boots. That's how we got turned away in Vancouver, and then we crossed in cars because we were coming down in a bus, and we ended up there.
Yeah.
And the suspicion around that was now that anytime they bothers them, what bothers the right, they call it Antifa activism, which is all bad jacketing, and then they pass laws and executive orders to ban protest, to ban activism, and a lot of times, like in Gaza protests, people were worried about being surveilled because they were taking pictures of people, facial recognition.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They took facial recognition pictures of protesters here on campus in the encampment, and that's how come the president of the university, and I hope he can hear me, he said that we know there's only 25% of the encampment protesters were students. How come? Because they compared it to, they took facial recognition pictures and one card access. That's how they knew. They compared them against one card, right? Anyway, don't get me started. I started already.
It's interesting too because COVID, like if you're anti-lockdown, so-called activists and anti-vax activism, really use the language of past leftist movement.
Oh yeah, they're co-opting it completely.
They co-opted it,
Yeah.
and that's another interesting thing that they've done.
My body, my choice. When I saw that,
I know, it's like...
my jaw was, I picked it up off the floor. The truckers were saying, oh, don't jab us, don't give us a vaccine, my body, my choice. Such a groundbreaking feminist slogan is kidnapped, basically, by the truckers.
And that makes it difficult.
Yeah. Gee, did you hear that sign? My body, my choice.
I have a question.
Yeah.
You were describing, Sarayan, this new left movement being centered around culture. I don't know if that's still the left movement of today, but I feel like it is. But if culture is being hijacked by the right, if they're taking the slogans, the space, formerly like leftist, you could say, ways of protesting, where does activism go from there? Maybe that was also part of your question.
Yeah.
But I'm just thinking through like, okay, if that's the case, then does the left move back towards the politics of the economy, or towards the base as opposed to the superstructure? Like, is that the direction that it needs to go in at this point?
I have we can also the right stole from the left, so let's steal from the right and get back into the base and get involved in politics again. And because that's actually a big part of what they did and why they've been so successful is because they were able to infiltrate structures of power. So the police, city government, municipal governments, provincial governments, federal government. I mean, look at some of the people who are MPs in this province, right? I mean, that's only recent. I mean, you go back to the Reform years, and even the Reform Party would have kicked out somebody like Michael Cooper, and now they're just accepted. So I think you do have to go back, take a step back, and I mean, in the U.S. they got what are they called? The mothers of, what are they? Basically the parental rights people into school boards so that they could ban critical race theory and any gender information. I mean,
Moms for Liberty?
Yeah.
Liberty.
For liberty. Yeah. But yeah,
So
and
what does that mean for art? Like then where does art go?
But that's what I mean, like, I think you could be very creative also, though, in the broadcast space as well. And one of the advantages of podcasting, it's actually fairly cheap now compared to even when it first started 15 years ago. You can get free software to make podcasts. You can get microphones. You can post your podcast to multiple spaces. You can go on YouTube. I mean, there are just more and more spaces now again for people, and sometimes, yes, you know, you get, these are private companies that'll sometimes take you down, but I mean, you just keep moving around and keep doing it. And force the way in public art is, I think that what you were showing, some of that artwork that's just almost, that just shows up in front of people. And you made a point, not when you were going over the presentation, about also using art as as a way to hide protesting, which I thought was fascinating too. If you're making art, like the police come by and go, "What are you doing?" "Oh, I'm making art." They're more likely to dismiss it, and it's subversive.
And that is, I think, the power of, well, amongst the many powers of art, that it is overlooked by the right. Like people usually dismiss it. Its value is undervalued, and so that's perhaps where we act in the interstices. So that's why I'm trying to abolish the category of activist art, so that we can recognize all efforts in art, and it's an all hands on deck time.
Yeah.
So whatever contributes to the overall goal, I think, should be recognized. And if we go into the nitty gritty of it, like, that's the problem of the left, and always has been, like the little sections that fight each other, whereas the right becomes
Coalesce.
Yeah.
Fight the law.
Most basic ideas. They
Yeah.
find it, you know, like the tech bros are throwing Nazi salutes and everybody's still okay with it.
Oh, but it was a joke. It was
Oh,
ironic.
he was joking. I didn't think that he has a funny bone at all.
He's not joking, but that's what
That's
they'll
what he
say.
said in the end.
He said-
That's
what they
lots
say.
of commentators said.
Yeah, and the tech bros are all in Trump's bed now, you know, so,
Yeah.
right. Even like that activist art online and social media, we can't rely on that anymore,
No.
you know.
But I do have a thought about the question you asked, Justine, about the base versus culture kind of thing. I think that in the contemporary moment, that it is very, very important to think about production, social reproduction in particular, so the base economy and all of those kinds of things. But I think that you know, your question about then what happens to culture, what happens to art, is that in going back to the economy, one of the things we have to realize is that the base superstructure distinction was always a wrong distinction to begin with, right? That's just the mind-body split, in a sense, all over again. And I think that certain kinds of art, and this is the key thing, not every art, not all kinds of art do this. Jeff Koons, I don't know where that would fall in your kind of whole, taxonomy here in that kind of way.
I didn't count them for a reason.
Exactly, right? So certain kinds of art helps us get beyond those categorical, the schematism that we've inherited from the past in that kind of way. That's how I would want to sort of think about this. But I think let me just see if there's any last thoughts that people might have about this particular panel. Otherwise, I think we should applaud.
Yeah.